Hello, everyone. My name is Astrid Edwards. I'm the host of several bookish podcasts, and thanks to the State Library of Victoria, I get to live stream chats with brilliant and amazing Australian writers. Today, it is my great pleasure to introduce Mirandi Riwoe to you. Now, Mirandi in 2018 was shortlisted for the Stella Prize for The Fish Girl, and in 2020, the quite strange year we find ourselves in, she published a second literary novel, Stone Sky, Gold Mountain. Mirandi, welcome.
Hello, Astrid. Thank you for having me.
Now, you are coming to us from Queensland, aren't you?
Yes, I am from Brisbane.
Well, I envy you at the moment, and thank you for joining the State Library and myself all the way down here in cold and very strange Victoria. Now, congratulations on both your literary novels. I highly recommend everybody should read both The Fish Girl and Stone Sky, Gold Mountain. You have also written a feminist historical crime novel, the Heloise Chancey series.
Yes, I have.
Now, today, if it's I adore any writer who can cross genres, by the way, so well done on that. But today I'd really like to talk to you about your latest work, not just because it is your latest work, Mirandi, but because I don't know, I think the work speaks to the global time that we find ourselves in and the conversations that we are all having. So to kick us off, can you introduce us to Stone Sky, Gold Mountain?
Okay. Stone Sky, Gold Mountain. Here it is. It's set in North Queensland in 1870s. It's a book about the gold rush, but it's told through mostly through a Chinese point of view. So it's about some Chinese diggers, two siblings who come here. There were about 20,000 Chinese in the area at the time. So I've taken the stories of two siblings, a sister and a brother, and then they go into Maytown, which was a flourishing town at the time in the gold rush. They meet up with a white Australian girl named Miriam, and a bit of a friendship forms between the two girls. So the story is about their travels over a certain, I guess, one sort of wet season in North Queensland.
So aside from the fact that it's a beautiful story driven by characters, one of the things that sticks with me about this novel, and I had the great pleasure of reading an early copy at the beginning of January, so 6 months ago, is that you really explored a time in Australian history, so about 150 years ago, end of the 19th century, that I didn't know very much about, but also what I did know was, from, what was always the kind of dominant settler narrative and the kind of historical dot points. And you, of course, are writing a beautiful story of family and siblings, but from the Chinese migrant perspective. And I guess I hadn't seen that before. And I feel uncomfortable that I haven't read books from that perspective. And I suspect it might be because not many are published. But can you tell me how you brought this story to life? And by that, I mean your research, but also, your motivation for telling this story.
Well, the motivation originally was, I'm Eurasian, my father's Chinese, and my original novels, which you mentioned, are set in Victorian London about a Eurasian women in Victorian London. So I sort of looked into the history of Asian population of that Victorian London area, but I wanted to write something set in Australia. And so I started to think, I wanted to research the original Chinese here. And I mean, there were earlier Chinese, but most of them who did come here for some period of time was during that gold rush. And the Queensland gold rush was a bit later than the Victorian one. So I guess I just did that initial kind of, research like you would normally do. I went to Victoria quite a bit to, those areas. And you have some great museums there that cover the gold rush period. But being from Queensland, and I have lived in North Queensland, I kind of moved up the coast until I found out about Maytown near Cooktown, and Maytown, there's nothing there now, but at the time, like I said, it was flourishing. And like I always say, it had a lemonade factory, which I think just shows you how flourishing it was. And I guess I think even though it's from a Chinese point of view, I just tried to look at these characters as humans. I also looked into why they had left China. So a lot of them, there were sort of local wars happening in China, a lot of violence, a lot of poverty, and they heard about these wonderful places like Gold Mountain, which was America, and New Gold Mountain, which is Australia. And, you know, so I looked at why they left their areas to you know, look anew for riches, or, you know, another way of life, or most of them wanted to make a fortune and take it back to China, to, you know, to their families. So that's probably where their story stemmed from, was looking into why, you know, real Chinese sojourners left China to come here. And so, and, you know, when you're reading about these real people, then you're starting to sort of build little stories in your mind of who these characters might be. Yeah.
Did anything surprise you along the way, you know, through your research?
I guess um, I didn't realize, you know, like one of my characters, or the siblings, their siblings are sort of sold off um, into um, sort of slavery, servitude slavery. Um, I didn't realize about that. I read about that a little bit, so I didn't realize that was happening. Um, what else surprised me was the sheer number of Chinese that were in that North Queensland area, and that there were like 4 or 5 times more Chinese to the white Australians there, or the European people who'd come over to dig for gold. That was really surprising, just how kind of established they were in businesses up north before the White Australia policy was implemented. So, yeah, so I think that, and, you know, and then you find out all the other things like taxes and everything. So, but the biggest surprises were the numbers, and also maybe how terrible conditions were. Yeah.
That's a huge, it kind of leads into my next question. So Australia has, you know, has been racist and practiced racist policies for a very long time. And in your story, we see how the Chinese migrants experienced, you know, the daily racism, which was often quite violent. But we also see, you know, the beginnings of that structural racism. So, you know, you just mentioned, you know, 4 to 5 times more Chinese migrants in Queensland than European migrants, and yet, you know, the laws and different structures already being built. So, you know, the two that stand out for me are, you know, the kind of approach to guns, but also the approach to taxation, which is the state discriminating.
Mm.
Can you
Well,
talk?
that all sort of began in Victoria. So what happened is, and it would have been a good 10, 15 years beforehand, that they even the government had to set up a system of protection for the Chinese, because they were being, you know, racially abused or attacked so much. So they had guards and translators sort of set up just for the Chinese who came in. I mean, and it was a bit of a worldwide phenomenon at the time, of this sort of fear. And I would say, see, this is the thing. I would say some of the rhetoric is the same still now. This, you know, and unfortunately, of course, with COVID-19, it's ramped up a bit again. But the same sort of rhetoric of, you know, just they're going to take over land and jobs and everything, you know, just with their sheer numbers. And, you know, because we always look at them as this sort of like, you know, in the gold rush, we look at the Chinese as this sort of big horde or big pack, not as individuals, which is what I've tried to show in my book, as individuals and why they came here. But certainly in Victoria, and I know by the turn of the century, a couple of times, sort of a little union of Chinese people got together to present a letter to the government to say, you know, we've, you know, they had an agreement with China that the British, or, you know, and the British subjects could go into China and not be harassed, you know, or taxed, or all these things, that Australia wasn't reciprocating, I guess, you know. And then, of course, after after a while in the gold rush in Victoria, they set up a huge tax to just for the Chinese, not the Europeans, just for the Chinese to go digging. So I think what happened is then the Chinese, a lot of them would get off in South Australia and walk up, this long, long track. Anyway, in North Queensland, 10, 15 years later, it was the same. They taxed the Chinese heavily. And I think the one in Victoria, like I was reading a historian just the other day saying it was equivalent to something like $10,000 now. I mean, we look at it and we go, oh, it was £10 or £100, but actually it was a significant amount at the time, just to deter them, I guess. But so there was that sort of discrimination. And then, of course, like you said, was, the racist attacks. And you can read about that even just with Lambing Flat. And like I was saying with the guns, to a certain extent, they were confiscated. Or I know in North Queensland, a lot of the time they used white guards who had the guns so they could just get on with their, because so they're not coolies, but so the workers, I guess, like my two characters are, wouldn't have had guns, and perhaps their tongues wouldn't have even allowed them. So they actually used white guards, which is how I introduce some elements of my novel through Clem, through the Scottish play. So there was quite and then of course all of that led into the White Australia policy eventually, which will go in another book.
I'm looking forward to that book. As I mentioned before, Mirandi, I read this novel really early in 2020, and obviously before this interview, I've come back to it, and not only have I, learnt more and taken more from the story this time, but my whole approach to the novel, because the world has changed around me and is continuing to change, I felt like it was almost even more pertinent, and I read different things into it. I just thank you. I don't have
thank you, Astrid.
I'm just genuinely kind of trying to grapple with, how much a fictional story can teach us all about the current day. So, the book is not about racism, but there are so many different elements of a structured society and a society, post gold rush, that's trying to put itself together, trying to make an economy, trying to make, money in society. And they're all different levels, and white people impose a structure from the top down. But that is not to say that Chinese migrants don't actively participate in racism as well.
Absolutely.
So can you talk to me about that as a general historical fact, but also how you explored it in the novel?
Well, I guess, so I heard another writer saying this the other day. I wouldn't want my novel to be didactic as such. I guess what you want it to be is illuminating, because a lot of this information you can find, it's just probably, it's not necessarily taught at schools or anything. And I think there's a level of sort of social memory that's cloaked, like people don't want to remember, or a society doesn't want to think of themselves like that, so they, so it's sort of forgotten about or swept under the carpet. So what I've tried to do, I certainly, with my novel, I won't go into spoilers, but in my novel I did want to show that, well, first of all, that yes, that I guess the British Australians were quite new to the land themselves. That's why I tried to show through accents. I wouldn't normally go with the full Irish or Scottish accent, but I was trying to show that they were as new to the land as some of the Chinese, and that they were quite, but they were the lawmakers and the gatekeepers already to this country that really wasn't theirs. And but then, so I've shown that that's through the Chinese, but also I wanted to show that the Chinese, just in being in the area and in what they were doing, were also complicit in what happened to the local Aboriginal people, the Western Yulanji people who I conferred with. So I tried to show that, especially through the brothers. So what I'm trying to do is, like I was saying to you, Astrid, the other day, somebody was complaining that, why do people still harp on about, the past when, and she said something, it was in a comment on one of my reviews, and she said, why can't we move on, because it's it's good now for the majority of us. And I mean, you just like, get the majority, like what, and the others, So I just think also you're sort of trying to show where that system of racism, or how the system has worked and has built up from that. I mean, things have gotten better, but some things haven't changed or haven't gotten, they're not good enough yet, and that would be, with racism or, feminist issues, like the domestic violence or whatever. Many things haven't come far enough. And so I think it's good to sort of illuminate where these things started, and and also to understand where, feelings on behalf of people of color or Aboriginal people, where it stems from, like these generations of I don't know, mourning, comes from, or feeling like outsiders in their own society, or their own country.
Absolutely. There is so much that we need to remember and learn from, and change in the present moment. I had the recent delight to speak with Michael Muhammad Ahmad, who is the editor of a new anthology coming out.
Wow.
Called After Australia, and the only contributors to that anthology are Indigenous people or migrants to Australia of a non-white, non-Anglo background. And in our conversation, we had a fascinating discussion about the background and the culture of a reader, or an interviewer. In this case, I'm obviously a white interviewer. Reading your work prompts different reactions. And now that your book has been out for a while, I'm wondering if you are noticing different patterns, depending on who is reading your work, or even when they read your work.
Look, when it first came out, I was I've written this book that's supposed to be, I guess, a bit sympathetic to, or highlighting racism against Chinese, and sympathetic to, a couple of Chinese individuals, or a few Chinese individuals. So I did think maybe, its timing this year was a bit unfortunate. But then, I said that to a couple of people, and they were like, well, maybe it's good timing because it's reminding people, and I think it's true, to, you can't blame individuals for what is happening in the world at the moment. So I think that but then you've got to hope that the reader comes to the book anyway, just reading the blurb. So I've gotten, like, the other day, it was in I had a great review in the newspaper on the weekend, and then I noticed later that the comments, I realized later they must have a Google alert on White Australia policy or something, because I noticed all the comments were, they were like that historical one, and oh, I'm not going to read this book that's going to make me feel bad about being a white male in Australia, like, why do we always bag Australia? And I love Australia. It has nothing to do with whether you love Australia or not. And I think that's clear in the book anyway. And I guess that's not surprising. It's a bit irritating, but not surprising. What has surprised me is that probably what I spent most time with, grappling with, and over in this book, and really thinking through and angsting about, was how to represent what was happening to the Aboriginal people, the Yalanji people at the time. Because when you read the historical, your research, it's clear that even though I was looking for Chinese aspects, it's clear actually what really mattered, what was happening to the Aboriginal people. But the way it was portrayed in those primary sources was in either a matter-of-fact way, or gleefully, like what they were doing to the people. So it was sort of unpacking that. But I had to be really, really, I was very, very aware that I didn't want to appropriate any voices. I know there are brilliant Queensland or Aboriginal Queensland writers who are writing these stories. It's not my story to tell. So all I could do was write what maybe my characters saw or experienced themselves to do with that. And I did want to show that they were complicit anyway. But so what surprised me is that a couple of times, and I was a bit worried. I didn't want to offend any Aboriginal people with what I wrote either, So I was trying to be, um, so I had to go through all that. And like I said, I conferred with the Yulanji people and another Aboriginal writer about my novel. But so what surprised me was a couple of times in book clubs, white Australian women asked me, like, this is a book about racism. Why isn't there more about Aboriginal people in there? Like, quite, one of them was quite accusing, and and I explained myself, but I realised, actually, I guess maybe because they're not writers and they don't have to think about appropriation and those sort of things, they wanted me to write from the point of view of, say, an Aboriginal character maybe, and showing that side, which I understand that they think that would be fairer, but I can't do. I just think because they're not writers, they don't realise maybe I'm that's for somebody else to write, not for me. So that's been surprising, because that wasn't an aspect I thought would happen. If anything, I would have thought maybe I'd offend people and they'd say, that's not your place to write about that, not the other way around, not that actually they wanted more.
Well, as you say, there are other brilliant Australian writers who can write that and are writing those stories.
Exactly. So
more books to buy.
Yes, exactly. So that was interesting. That's interesting.
Mirandi, you also deal with violence, particularly domestic violence, and gender. Now, I'd like you to introduce us to Ying as a character. We've kind of mentioned her a few times, but really skated over her storyline, and how, she pretends to be a little boy for safety. I mean, it's an extraordinary choice that she makes for her own safety. Can you talk us through that and gender issue at the time?
So these siblings had to escape together. They've decided to come to Australia for the gold rush. There's I think in the time, actually, there are only 2 or 3 Chinese women in Australia, going by local, census at the time. And the only way she could have gotten away with being on a gold dig was being male. So they disguise her as a boy. And actually, the more I talk about it, the more I wonder if it happened more often, because anyway. Anyway, so she's disguised herself as a boy with her brother. When she gets to town, she finds work with Jimmy in a shop, because a lot of the grocery shops in Maytown and in Cooktown were owned by the Chinese, and that's where she strikes up a friendship with Miriam, and sort of an accidental friendship. But Miriam never realizes she's a girl, so she just carries on as a boy. And Ying finds a lot of, I guess, independence, and sees more of life, I think, as a boy, and realizes it. Yes.
Absolutely. Going along on her journey as a young male, she gets to do plenty of things that she otherwise would not have been able to do. And one of those things, ironically, is to befriend Miriam and strike up that very intense friendship. And of course, Miriam leads us to Sophie. And Miriam and Sophie are 2 white women living on the very edges of society, not just physically, but literally on the edges of society, not welcome in polite society, shall we say. And through their story, we really see violence against women, and the different levels of hierarchy and class that women had to endure, separate to everything else. But we also saw, what it means for a woman to have an income, and how that can be a liberating factor in various different ways. And I guess I just wanted to talk to you about, the violence that Sophie experiences is still, without any change, happening today in Brisbane and Melbourne. And it's difficult to even consider.
Well, that's right. And that's what I try to write, even though my work is historical fiction, even that racist scene in the shop, or what happens to Sophie. I mean, these are things actually I'm taking from now, and actually I guess what you're saying is things haven't changed enough, because like I've put this quite comfortably in a historical novel set 150 years ago, and this sort of menacing behavior and like the domestic violence and the racist attacks are still happening. I mean, um, who would think? I mean, if you didn't look closely enough, or if you didn't live in that sort of world, you would think it's not still happening, but actually that's not true. It's still happening. So I guess that's what I try to do with my historical fiction is, I try to reflect on now actually. So, um, and I guess those sort of things, still make me angry, so that you can find a place for it, in my work.
They make me angry too,
Mm,
Mirandi.
mm.
No spoilers in this chat that we're having, but I really like what happened, to Ying at the end, and we see her. The story opens with her leaving China, and the story ends with new horizons for her, much of which she likes, some of which maybe she wouldn't have chosen, but there's still opportunity and a future for her.
Mm.
And because her voice is so different than anything, or much of Australian literature set in that time, are you going to go back to her story? Can we have a sequel to Stone Sky Gold Mountain where she goes?
I have considered, the thing is, Astrid, I'm not quite sure what happens with her. I can see, um, I can see a couple of ways that her life would play out. Um, so I'm not quite sure. I did because I am writing a book. I will be writing a book about a Chinese man and an Irish woman getting married and their family over 150 years. And I did think of maybe mentioning a shop in North Queensland somewhere run by this Chinese man and Miriam. Like just but that would be just background. I might sneak her in somewhere. I don't think I would do another book just on her.
I really like
Because I guess because, or maybe I would. I don't know. Maybe with enough time between them, Astrid, I would. I think just at the moment, I like for Ying not knowing, just for Ying because she is kind of adventurous.
it is a good ending to the novel. You just mentioned the next book that you're writing. Can you give us a little introduction to that, if that's even possible at this stage?
Well, at the moment, I'm started work on a book set in Indonesia again. Like, so it's based on um, in Java just before the Japanese invade. So in World War II, and what happens about a Dutch pilot, and he's allowed to take loved ones to Australia. They were sent down to, when the Japanese were about to arrive, they were sent down to Broome. So it's sort of it'll be another historical novel set around that. And the other one, which I have started on actually, because I want it to be a bit like Thea Astley's It's Raining in Mango. So I want it to be interconnecting characters over 150 years from this one Eurasian family. And so that's sort of like a follow-on from Stone Sky Gold Mountain. But I thought I'd give readers a rest in between.
Readers don't need a rest. Mirandi, that sounds actually really quite exciting. I'm looking forward to
Thank you, Astrid.
Thank you so much for your time today. And for those listening, can I please, exhort you all to pick up Mirandi's book? It is truly stunning and it speaks to the times. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Thank you, Astrid.